In 2024, while American citizens have the freedom to travel to many parts of the world, there are still several countries where they face significant restrictions or are outright banned from entering. Political tensions, safety concerns, and diplomatic disputes have led some nations to close their doors to US travelers. In this video, we'll explore the top 15 countries where Americans are not allowed to visit in 2024, highlighting the reasons behind these restrictions and the geopolitical factors that influence these travel bans. Whether you're a frequent traveler or just curious, this list provides valuable insights into the complexities of international relations today. 15. Belarus. In 2024, Belarus remains a highly restricted and dangerous country for American travelers due to its authoritarian political environment, close alliance with Russia, and ongoing internal repression. Following the widely contested 2020 presidential elections, where President Alexander Lukashenko declared victory amid accusations of voter fraud, the Belarusian government has cracked down on dissent, freedom of speech, and protests. US citizens who attempt to travel to Belarus face significant risks, including arbitrary detention, especially if suspected of being involved in political activism or journalism. The US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory for Belarus, warning of the unpredictable legal system and lack of due process. Americans can be detained for minor offenses or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they may face long periods in detention without consular access. In addition, Belarus has been increasingly isolated from the international community due to its support for Russia in the war with Ukraine. The Belarusian government's alignment with Moscow has led to the imposition of sanctions by Western nations, further complicating travel. Moreover, the civil unrest and occasional violence in response to government repression increase the likelihood of foreign travelers, including Americans, being caught in dangerous situations. With few diplomatic options and increasing internal instability, traveling to Belarus in 2024 poses severe risks, making it a high-alert destination for US citizens. 14. Russia. In 2024, Russia remains a challenging and hostile environment for American travelers, primarily due to the ongoing conflict with Ukraine and the geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West. The US State Department has issued a Level 4 Do Not Travel advisory for Russia, citing risks of arbitrary enforcement of local laws, potential for harassment, and the lack of access to US consular services. While Americans are not officially banned from entering Russia, they face heightened scrutiny, especially in light of strained diplomatic relations. The Russian government has been known to detain US citizens on espionage or politically motivated charges, using them as leverage in diplomatic disputes. Moreover, the general anti-Western sentiment within Russia can make Americans targets for discrimination, surveillance, or harassment by local authorities. The ongoing war with Ukraine has led to extensive sanctions and restrictions, making travel even more complex. Furthermore, the suspension of many direct flights between the US and Russia adds logistical hurdles, and the political climate could result in sudden changes to entry requirements. For Americans who need to travel to Russia for business or personal reasons, the risks associated with arbitrary arrests, deportations, and a lack of legal recourse remain significant deterrents. 13. Cuba. While US citizens are technically allowed to travel to Cuba under specific categories, such as family visits, educational programs, or humanitarian work, the embargo and restrictions on tourism remain in place. US travelers cannot legally visit Cuba solely for tourism, and any travel must fall under one of the 12 authorized categories defined by the US Treasury Department. The US government also warns travelers of the potential risks of staying in Cuban government-owned hotels due to past incidents involving unexplained health problems reported by American diplomats. 12. Eritrea. Eritrea has one of the most repressive governments in the world, and while Americans can technically obtain visas to visit, the country's restrictions make it an undesirable destination for US travelers. The government tightly controls all movement within the country, requiring foreigners to obtain travel permits for any movement outside the capital city of Asmara. There have been reports of Americans being detained or harassed by Eritrean authorities, particularly those suspected of political activism or journalism. given the severe restrictions on freedom of speech, movement, and access to information. The U.S. State Department advises against travel to Eritrea. 11. Central African Republic. The Central African Republic is one of the poorest and most unstable countries in the world, with ongoing armed conflicts between various militia groups. While Americans are not banned from entering the country, the U.S. government has issued a Level 4 travel advisory due to the risks of violent crime, civil unrest, and kidnapping. The lack of government control in large parts of the country means that armed groups operate freely, often targeting foreigners for ransom or political leverage. Additionally, there is little to no U.S. consular presence in the country, leaving travelers vulnerable if they encounter any problems. 10. Sudan. The political situation in Sudan remains volatile, with ongoing conflicts in various parts of the country and a fragile transitional government. Americans are not officially banned but face significant risks of violence, civil unrest, and detention. There have been instances where foreigners were detained or expelled by Sudanese authorities, especially during periods of heightened political tension. The U.S. government advises its citizens not to travel to Sudan, as the country's unstable security environment poses severe risks and the lack of infrastructure makes it difficult to receive assistance in emergencies. 9. Iraq. Iraq continues to be a dangerous destination for American travelers, with a Level 4 do not travel advisory due to terrorism, armed conflict, and kidnapping. While the U.S. military has withdrawn the majority of its troops from Iraq, the presence of ISIS and other militant groups still makes it a dangerous place for Americans. There have been several instances of foreigners, particularly Americans, being kidnapped or killed in Iraq. Political instability and sectarian violence add to the danger, and without strong governmental control over certain areas, travelers are at risk of encountering hostile forces. 8. Venezuela. Although Venezuela doesn't outright ban American citizens, the relationship between the two nations has been tense for years due to political sanctions, economic restrictions, and diplomatic standoffs. Under President Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela has become increasingly hostile to the U.S. and Americans have faced detention or deportation when traveling there. The U.S. Embassy suspended operations in Caracas in 2019, leaving no official diplomatic support for U.S. travelers. Due to widespread crime, economic collapse, food shortages, and political unrest, the U.S. government advises against travel to Venezuela, as U.S. citizens have been targets for robbery, kidnapping, and extortion. 7. Afghanistan. Following the Taliban's return to power in 2021, Afghanistan has become a highly dangerous country for Americans, with the U.S. State Department issuing a do not travel advisory. The Taliban's strict enforcement of its interpretation of Islamic law and its hostility toward Western nations, particularly the U.S., make it extremely dangerous for American citizens to visit. Furthermore, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul has been closed since 2021, leaving American travelers without consular support. Terrorist groups such as ISIS-K remain active in the country, adding another layer of danger. U.S. citizens who attempt to enter Afghanistan risk detention, violence, and possibly being used as political bargaining chips in the country's complex and volatile political environment. 6. Somalia. Somalia has been engulfed in conflict for over 2 decades, with terrorism, piracy, and severe instability defining the country's political landscape. While the central government controls parts of the capital Mogadishu, large portions of the country remain under the control of terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab, which routinely target foreigners for kidnapping and attacks. The U.S. government strongly advises against travel to Somalia, as there is no U.S. embassy presence in the country, and there are constant threats of violence and terrorism. Americans attempting to travel to Somalia could face severe risks from armed groups or terrorist organizations that are hostile to U.S. interests. The situation is made worse by the lack of infrastructure and medical facilities, making it a high-risk destination for any American. 5. Libya. Libya has been in a state of chaos since the ousting of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, with various armed factions vying for control over the country. The security situation in Libya is extremely unstable, with terrorist groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and local militias operating with little oversight. Americans are not officially banned from entering Libya, but the US State Department has issued the highest level of travel advisory due to the risk of kidnapping, violence, and arbitrary detention. Since 2014, the US has no longer maintained an embassy in Tripoli, making consular support non-existent. Foreign nationals, particularly Westerners, have been targeted for abduction or assault, and the Libyan government is unable to guarantee their safety due to its fractured nature and ongoing civil conflict. 4. Yemen. Yemen is currently embroiled in a devastating civil war that has caused widespread famine and a humanitarian catastrophe. Since the conflict escalated in 2015 between the Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed Yemeni government, the country has become a no-go zone for Americans. The US government has placed Yemen under a Level 4 do not travel advisory due to terrorism, civil unrest, and kidnapping. The US Embassy in Yemen suspended operations in 2015, meaning there is no US diplomatic or consular presence to assist Americans in the country. Yemen's security situation is dire, with frequent airstrikes, militant attacks, and mass displacement, creating dangerous conditions for any foreign traveler, particularly US citizens who could be targeted for ransom or political gain. 3. Syria. Ongoing civil war, terrorism, and a humanitarian crisis have made Syria one of the most dangerous places in the world, particularly for Americans. The US government has placed strict travel advisories against visiting Syria since 2011. Syria's Assad regime, which is supported by Russia and Iran, has been engaged in brutal fighting with rebel groups and terrorist organizations like ISIS, which has made the situation volatile and unpredictable. Americans are not officially banned from entering Syria but face significant risks of kidnapping, death, or imprisonment. The regime has also been known to use foreign nationals as leverage in diplomatic negotiations. Additionally, most Western governments, including the US, have closed their embassies in Syria, meaning there's no consular support available for citizens in distress. Americans who attempt to enter Syria, particularly those doing so without the backing of humanitarian organizations, are at high risk of violence or abduction. 2. Iran. The relationship between the US and Iran has been tense for decades, particularly since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the US embassy hostage crisis. After the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, diplomatic ties worsened further, leading to increased hostility and more stringent entry requirements for Americans. While Iran does not have an outright ban on US citizens, they are subject to extensive vetting and often need to be part of pre-arranged tours led by Iranian government-approved organizations. The Iranian government has also detained American citizens in the past, often on charges of espionage or hostile activities, which has led to long and politically charged imprisonments due to these risks, along with the broader political climate and lack of diplomatic representation. Iran remains a hostile and dangerous destination for US travelers in 2024. 1. North Korea. Since 2017, Americans have been officially banned from traveling to North Korea due to heightened safety concerns following the death of Otto Warmbier, an American student who was detained and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor for allegedly attempting to steal a propaganda poster. The US State Department has consistently warned Americans against travel to North Korea due to the risk of arbitrary detention and lack of access to consular assistance, as the US has no formal diplomatic relations with the regime. Even under supervised tours, North Korean authorities closely monitor all foreigners, with very little freedom of movement. The isolated state views any contact with locals or any actions perceived as critical of the government as potential grounds for arrest. Consequently, any attempt to travel to North Korea, even with permission from the US government, comes with the risk of being used as a political pawn, making it a high-risk destination for US citizens,